Hello and welcome to episode 38 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and the holidays are coming up. We got Saturnalia and the feast day of Sol Invictus coming up, Yule, and so we got the pagan accoutrement accoutrement in the background to the gnome. We got a gnome. So without any further ado, I'm going to answer questions. And we've got a fair amount, a little more than the usual number, I think. And the first question is from Rafi46, and this is kind of an interesting one. What does Buddhism think about parents who raise their children by spanking them? And I don't remember ever seeing anything about parents like disciplining their children in like Buddhist texts. I assume it's in there somewhere, maybe like the sub commentaries or something. But I assume that so long as the parents are spanking their children just as a way of like giving them discipline, like, I mean, they're not like pissed off and just wailing on them because they're in a bad mood. I mean, that obviously would be bad karma and would be more harmful for the children than good for them, more harmful for everyone involved. Um, just giving them a swat on the behind when they're so young that they can't really understand much of anything else. I don't think that Buddhism in general would disapprove of that strongly. I mean, kind of like really orthodox Theravada Buddhism just disapproves of having children in general, but or just doing the deed that results in children. Um, but I think just disciplining them with, like the old saying, this is going to hurt you more than, or it's going to hurt me more than it hurts you, that kind of a thing. I mean, so long as you're doing it sincerely for the sake of like trying to make your kids better people, um, yeah, I don't think it's that bad. I was spanked a little bit when I was a kid, and look at me now. Look how I've become. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is also from Rafi46. And Rafi46 says, I should say, one sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya records that the Buddha spoke of 7 types of a wife. The first 3 kinds are heading for unhappiness in this world or the next. One of them is the tyrant wife, who the Buddha described, among other things, as being domineering. Does this mean that the ideal Buddhist wife should be devout towards her husband? It's Devot. So maybe it's devoted. So the ideal Buddhist wife should be devoted towards her husband. There is a sutta, it's a famous one. It's one of the relatively few that's directed towards the lay people rather than towards monks, called the Sigalo Sutta. I don't remember what Nikaya it's in, maybe the Majjhima, I don't remember now, where he goes into the qualities of a good wife. And a good wife should be, I mean, she shouldn't waste her husband's money. She should be faithful to him. She should, take care of the house. She should keep the home in order. Manage the servants and all that if there are any. Um, so I guess a Buddhist wife might be a little better off than one in the Bible that's just supposed to obey. So yeah, I would advise anyone wanting to know like the proper duties of a Buddhist layperson towards other Buddhist lay people would be in the Sigalo Vada Sutta, which I'm sure there are plenty of translations. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck says, what do you think of Buddhist veganism? Are you one yourself? Um, no, I'm not. I've never been a vegan. Vegan? I don't even know how to pronounce it. How can I be one? Um, I used to be a vegetarian, and ironically, I stopped being vegetarian after I became a monk. I was living in this desert wasteland in central Burma, and sometimes all I'd get in my bowl would be like pink chewy rice and pork and some badass cookies that were, I mean, they were just like zero nutritional value in the cookies. So it was a matter of just survival. that I started eating meat again. Um, just left to my own devices, I tend to be inclined towards what in Hinduism would be called a sattvic diet, which is largely vegetarian. I mean, it's technically vegetarian. It's like fruits, nuts, grains, and dairy products. But my sweetheart is somewhat of a carnivore, and so I'm eating quite a lot of meat myself. In fact, I had a pork chop for dinner. So, with regard to veganism, yeah, I just would not give up dairy products, especially like cheese and milk. I just like that too much. It doesn't make much sense to just become a pure vegan. It's not really good for your health. We are not evolved to be vegans. So, um, I used to, when I was a vegetarian, I would occasionally eat shellfish because as a biologist, I know that they don't have a nervous system like we do. They apparently don't have pain receptors. They apparently don't feel pain. So they don't mind being killed as much as like a cow or a chicken does. But even devout Theravada Buddhists eat meat as a general rule. The Buddha himself ate meat. In fact, he died after eating some bad pork, according to the legend. Although the Mahayana Buddhists changed that into a mushroom. I mean, the original term for what the Buddha ate right before he died was sukara madawa. Sukara means pig, madawa means tender or tenderized. So probably it means tender pork. But the Mahayana Buddhists who were vegetarian didn't want to believe that the Buddha ate meat, and so they they interpret it as something tender that pigs like to eat, like truffles or mushrooms, something like that. But there are rules in the ancient rules of monastic discipline, like saying a monk is not allowed to ask for dainty food like meat, including meat, fish, milk, a few others, unless he's sick, which of course means that he can eat it. Unless also there's the proviso that if he's given permission to ask for whatever he wants in advance, then he can ask for meat. But so yeah, Theravada Buddhism is not even really vegetarian. Devadatta, who's like the villain in ancient Buddhist history, he's sort of like the Buddhist Judas Iscariot. He demanded that the Buddha require all monks to be vegetarian, and the monk said, or the Buddha said, um, monks can be vegetarian if they want, but it's not going to be mandatory. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And I think Fred's got another question farther down that I forgot about this one when I was compiling the list. Anyway, Fred says, does going beyond perception and feeling mean one is going beyond the aggregates? Um, well, there'd still be consciousness, so it wouldn't be going beyond the aggregate of consciousness. Um, Does going beyond, this is kind of a deep question though. Does going beyond perception and feeling mean one is going beyond the aggregates? Going beyond perception and feeling, it's one of the most advanced or exalted or subtle meditative states there is. The cessation of perception and feeling, um, which is kind of a sort of a deep trance state, but it's only temporary. And I guess to the extent that I mean, you're not identifying with the aggregates or um, if there's no perception and no feeling, it would mean that those are dormant. Those two aggregates are dormant, but it is just temporary, and you still have five aggregates at least on standby the whole time. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. We'll get to another one from Fred a little later. And this is from Tut DVD. And Tut DVD says, often you hear people say they want to follow what the Buddha actually taught. Why? Is it not fair to say this idea of the Buddha as an ultimately enlightened person authority has been exaggerated over time? You saw firsthand with the stories of your levitating over the city the crazy embellishments people get up to. So why After all these years, would the Buddha and his original teachings hold any special significance? Everyone seems to have different ideas of what was or wasn't actual Buddha's words, but ultimately it's guesswork. And why does it matter what one guy had to say anyway? What I deduct as the historical Buddha most likely being was a poet and contemplative. Why hold him up in any special regard? Well, I mean, if you're a Buddhist, then you would be following what the Buddha taught. I mean, it says in the texts that, I mean, the Buddha said, after he died, the Dhamma itself is the teacher. And I really doubt that he encouraged people to worship him. That's any, like, devotionalism, I assume, is a later development in Buddhism. But when I became a Buddhist monk, I mean, I wanted to follow what the Buddha taught because he's the founder of the system. And he supposedly was an enlightened being. And I mean, if you want to become a Buddhist, it seems like it would be pretty much, it'd be important to actually follow what the founder taught. Like a Christian, presumably, would want to follow what Jesus taught, or a Muslim would want to follow what Muhammad taught because they were the founders of the system, and they presumably knew better than anyone else what people should do, at least within the context of the system that they founded. And so it is true, there's all kinds of weird mythology associated with the Buddha that uh, in a lot of cases can be weeded out. You do a little detective work, you have to examine things carefully and try to determine as well as you can what the Buddha did and did not teach. And you're not going to be 100% correct, but at least if you use some intelligent methods, then at least you'll get closer to the truth. At least you'll weed out a lot of the deadwood. Um, so, yeah, it just seems common sense to me that the Buddha was wiser than me, and so if I'm going to be a Buddhist, then it's like a duty to try to follow as well as you can what the Buddha taught. I mean, you're taking the risk of being mistaken in your interpretation, but then again, you're taking a risk of being mistaken in any interpretation of anything. So it's just um, it's a fairly solid. I mean, once you can weed out most of the mythology and the like the devotionalism and that sort of thing, and you're just following his instructions that are found in the texts, then yeah, I mean, if you've got a teacher that is a Buddhist, or whoever your teacher is, you can follow what he says too. I mean, it's then you'd want to know for sure what your teacher said you should and shouldn't do. Um, Part of the thing is that you're assuming that the teacher knows more than you do or knows better than you do. And so it makes sense to try to follow as well as you can what he said you should do, and bear in mind that he's probably wiser than you. And so it just makes sense. I mean, you have to make your own decisions, including the decision to follow this teacher or that teacher, or to start or stop following some teacher. I mean, you have to make your own decisions, but still, if you find an authority, someone that you think is wiser than you, who understands reality better than you, then you want to try to, take that seriously and find out as well as you can what the person did or did not teach. So it's kind of an interesting question, although I mean, for me, that was really all I wanted to do, was find out as well as I could what the historical Gautama Buddha taught and follow it, because after all, I was a member of the Sangha that he founded. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, "So, Panyo, I know that you've left the monkhood, but do you miss it? I know you've resolved to live a quote unquote normal life, but is there anything from your old life that you wish you still did? If you don't answer, that's okay. Ciao." Well, one thing that was nice about being a monk is meant you didn't have to work for a living. And so you can just meditate and contemplate and study. And I had more energy then, or at least I was expending my energy in a more dharmic and contemplative and philosophical way, and wasn't having to make money and pay bills, that sort of thing. So, I mean, there is that. Also, my mental states were often more subtle than they are now, just because you've got less commotion going on. You're just living this quiet life, often in a cave out in the forest. And I mean, it was just very simple. And so you didn't have a lot of commotion going on to distract you and everything, and your mind could get really chilled out. So that was kind of nice too. But I have no regrets at all. I'm content living the way I am. My life is more joyful now than it was when I was living in a cave in a Burmese forest. But yeah, those would be the main things. Also, I kind of miss wall geckos. That I mean, anyone who's lived in Southeast Asia knows about wall geckos. They're these little lizards that change color and chirp like sparrows and run around on the walls, even on the ceilings. They can just run straight up a window pane. They're cool. I like those. But I guess that would be the main things that I miss. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Skeptic 46. And Skeptic 46 says, the more I read about Buddhism, the more I'm worried that the idea of enlightenment, or even just the control of one's emotions through meditation, is essentially depriving oneself of the magic of life. Isn't sadness and pain part of the human experience? We need darkness to see light and all that. If we eliminate all suffering, then how would we have anything to compare joy with? Well, I think there's like two parts to this question that I can answer. Um, with regard to joy and suffering, I mean, it's like a roller coaster ride. It's just up and down. And what a monk is going for isn't just joy. It's like a happiness that has no opposite. You know, it's just like divine bliss, you could say, like nirvana. It's just merging with ultimate reality. So, I mean, it's way beyond any worldly happiness. Just from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy, even ordinary happiness is a kind of dukkha or suffering, partly just because it's unreliable and very impermanent. Let's see. But the thing is, most people are just not ready for enlightenment. They don't even want enlightenment. I think most monks really don't want to become enlightened. I used to think when I was a junior monk that if somebody invented an enlightenment pill where you just take this pill and you become fully enlightened, I think even most monks would run from it as though it were a demon possessed rabid snake. Just because people are afraid of enlightenment, it's like a kind of death. Who you think you are either ceases to exist or just is completely transcended and becomes irrelevant. And most people just don't like that. There's in Buddhist cosmology, the entire physical universe gets destroyed usually by fire, you know, every zillion gajillion years. And so all the beings in the material universe have to go up into this really high heaven realm. And there are yogis and swamis and other meditators who try their entire lives to get into this meditation or to get into this heaven realm through practicing meditation and so forth. And a lot of them, most of them can't get there. But now, because the physical universe is destroyed, they have to go somewhere. And so just through whatever natural cosmic law or whatever, just everybody winds up in this very advanced heaven realm, including like mosquitoes and politicians and prostitutes and drug dealers, drug addicts, penguins, everything. They wind up in this very advanced heaven realm and they can't stand it. It's just like it's boring. They're just not ready for it. They're just not ready for just profound bliss. It's just boring to them. They want action, they want trouble. And so most people just aren't ripe for enlightenment. And one reason why where like the beings of this earth are not enlightened is just they don't even want it. It's just scary. They're just not ready for it. So if a person is ready for it, then it doesn't really matter if the so-called magic of life is gone, because it's infinitely better than the magic of life. Full enlightenment, it's just like merging with God, you know, in quotes. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Skeptic 46. Do you think it's bad karma that Brian Ruhe is so delusional about Hitler? I mean, it's enough to look at Hitler's earliest speeches and writings to know that this guy was a psychopathic lunatic. In a speech in 1920, for example, he said that he did not want to be an anti-Semite who wanted to create pogrom sentiment, but that he had an unrelenting determination to get to the root of the evil and eradicate it by any means necessary. Well, sweet tea. I do not agree with Brian Ruhe's assessment of the Fuhrer as just completely good guy. You know, he was the guy wearing the white hat, and people like Winston Churchill were the bad guys. Yeah, I don't go that far. Although I do think that Hitler has been demonized even more than Donald Trump by the mainstream. And he wasn't as bad as people claim he is. I mean, he wasn't as bad as just common knowledge that you read in history books. I mean, he certainly had his badness, but I mean, he wasn't a total delusional lunatic. I mean, or let's say a psychopathic lunatic. I mean, he obviously had enough sanity that he was very adept at politics up until he just started just annexing all of his neighboring countries. Um, I mean, it is true that he was anti-Semitic, and I mean, it's questionable whether he wanted to just genocide the entire Hebrew race. There was talk about just resettling them in Madagascar and that kind of a thing. He did have a few Jewish people that were friends, and I think there was at least one high-profile Jew in the SS. Um, So, I mean, but I mean, the main point of the question here is, do I think it's bad karma that Brian Ruhe believes what he believes about Hitler? Well, any kind of delusion can be called is bad karma. So, I mean, people that are delusional about Hitler in the opposite direction, who just think he's the evilest human being who ever lived, might be making worse karma simply because they've got a negative mental state going, this kind of like hatred and aversion. Whereas Brian Ruhe is just idealizing somebody and trying to see the best in them and succeeding apparently. So, I mean, I would say there's probably worse karma for the people that really just think Hitler was just pure evil. And as in most cases, probably the correct route to take with regard to Adolf Hitler is the middle path. I mean, he uh, he did cause a lot of trouble, especially in Europe, but so did Napoleon, and Napoleon isn't demonized. I mean, he uh, he may have, depending on your sources, wanted genocide, but then again, Moses was genocidal. You know, the founder of Judaism wanted the complete extermination of the Canaanites. He insisted upon it. He demanded it. And he's considered to be just a great prophet, not only by Jews, but also by Christians and Muslims. So I think Hitler just, he offended very grievously the wrong people. And they've had the knives out for him ever since. But I do not think he was as bad as Stalin, but Stalin was arguably a psychopathic lunatic also. And I don't think he was nearly as evil of a person as someone like Pol Pot. And of course, Mao killed more than Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot combined. So I'll just move on to the next question. Oh, but before I move on to this question, obviously Brian Ruhe has got some bad karma because he just can't get a break. He is, I mean, he's just, yeah, he's persecuted essentially. So, I mean, that would be the result of bad karma. Although, whether it's partly just because of his um, beliefs, yeah, I probably, yeah, but I think it's way more than that. I think um, just his beliefs about Adolf Hitler don't really account for all the trouble he has encountered in recent years. So I'll just move on to the next question. Also from Skeptic 46, and Skeptic 46 says, What made you believe in rebirth? Do you think it's possible to scientifically prove that rebirth exists? What? Well, that's two questions, I suppose. I'll take the first one first. What made me believe in rebirth? I'm not 100% sold on anything really. Um, but I do believe that anything that is possible is, I mean, it happens. Maybe, I mean, in some way, somehow, in an infinite universe, that, I mean, if anything is possible, it's going to happen, and it is happening. Um, but I mean, that just kind of opens the door, sort of metaphysically, for the possibility of it. Um, but the main reason why I take rebirth as a working hypothesis is because people much wiser than I am have endorsed it. Like not only Buddhism and Hinduism, but like one of my first spiritual teachers was Ram Dass. I just that's how um, he sort of red pilled me on worldliness to some degree. He was one of the first teachers that I had, a spiritual teacher that I had, just through his books. I never met him in person. My father firmly believed in rebirth. In fact, he claimed to remember some of his past lives. He very strongly identified with a past life back around the 1700s, a Scottish fellow named Jason Haskell. So when I was a kid, I was hearing stories about that. But yeah, it's mainly that people that I respect, who I consider to be very wise, for the most part, have endorsed it. And I mean, there is some scientific evidence, like Ian Stevenson, I think he was at the University of Virginia, did a lot of research, especially on small children that would claim to remember past lives. You know, they sometimes they would remember how they got murdered or something. They'd still be blaming somebody for killing them in their previous existence, like sort of thing. But I don't know if it's possible to scientifically prove that rebirth does or does not exist. I mean, science is very limited in what it is able to do, and scientific proof mainly just means that I mean, it seems to work until some other theory comes along and usurps it. I don't know if science even reaches as far as just the mechanism of how rebirth occurs, assuming that rebirth does occur. But I don't have firm faith in it. I just accept it as a working hypothesis. So I'll just move on to Skeptic 46's last question here. How can we criticize Islam from a Buddhist perspective using the Buddha's words? Well, there are suttas where the Buddha essentially mocks belief in a creator God. You know, he refers to it as the blind leading the blind, people that have never met God are teaching other people what God is like. In fact, there's this one sutta where he's got this, it's essentially a joke, where the Buddha says that someone who believes in God is like a man who says he's in love with the most beautiful woman in the world. So you ask this man, what's this most beautiful woman in the world? What does she look like? Is she tall or short? And he says, I don't know. Now, what color hair does she have? And he doesn't know. Does she have a light complexion or a dark complexion? He doesn't know. He doesn't know what her figure is like because he's never seen her before, but he's in love with the most beautiful woman in the world. And the Buddha compared that with a theist who's worshiping a god that he's never seen and really doesn't know about. So there's that. I mean, another obvious one, another obvious like way of criticizing Islam from a Buddhist perspective is just criticizing violence. I mean, violence is condemned in Buddhism, and Islam clearly it endorses violence. In fact, it endorses killing other human beings. I mean, and Muhammad himself was a kind of bandit. I mean, the Muslims accept this themselves. I mean, this isn't just some sort of Islamophobic rant. I mean, we know this stuff from the Muslims themselves, like their own records, that when the Buddha was living in Medina, he was supplementing his income and the incomes of his followers by doing bandit raids on caravans going from Mecca to Damascus or from southern Arabia to Damascus and back. And I mean, he fought in battles. He had people put to death. Like, I think it was the Jews of Medina. I think it was the Jews of Medina, where he had all the males massacred essentially and then sold all the women and children into slavery. So just some of his behavior of the founder of the system. I mean, just setting aside the atrocities perpetrated by Muslims afterwards, like one of the greatest genocides in history was the genocide of Indian Buddhists when the Muslim Turks invaded India, pretty much wiped out Buddhism in India. I mean, it wasn't the only cause, just like barbarian invasion wasn't the only cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire, but still, I mean, millions and millions and millions of Indian Buddhists were just killed because they weren't Muslims. So that would be probably the best ways of criticizing Islam from a Buddhist perspective is first just using Buddhist arguments against monotheism, and then using Buddhist arguments against um, violence in general, especially killing other humans. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is Fred's other question that I should have put under the put it under the first question by Fred, but I didn't notice that I did this. And Fred says, "Will smoking cannabis send you to hell?" And for most people, no. It depends. I mean, really, it's not the physical action that is good or bad in Buddhism. It's the mental states associated with the physical action. So if somebody smokes cannabis with really bad motives, that could help them to wind up in a bad place in the next life. But for most people, um, I don't think so. I mean, one of the reasons why I became a monk in the first place was because I started smoking cannabis as a teenager and took some psychedelics after that. Or, well, I started taking psychedelics shortly after I started smoking cannabis. And I mean, it can awaken somebody to alternative ways of looking at reality, which then gets them interested in meditation and just mysticism, Eastern spirituality in general. So will smoking cannabis send you to hell? Just the physical act, I mean, it won't send anybody to hell. But if somebody does it with really bad mental states, and maybe they do bad things when they're high, like they get reefer madness or something, then yeah, it's possible. But for the most part, I would say no. So the next question is from Austin. And Austin says, "What was the story of meeting your sweetheart? I'd imagine finding love was hard for you as a monk." Well, when we first met, at least digitally on the internet, I was still a monk in Burma. I was living in some monastery in Memyo or Pien Uluin, it's called. And I had recently started my new blog, my second blog. And mainly, I just got an account on minds.com, which is like alt Facebook. It's like a free speech version of Facebook, and a lot of the people that are kicked off Facebook go to Minds as refugees, or people that just despise Facebook to begin with, me being one of them. And people were just continually pestering me to get onto Facebook, and I just refused. So I compromised and got onto Minds.com instead. And my sweetheart was one of my first subscribers, I think. I'm not sure exactly what she liked about about my content, but there was just a certain resonance between us, and we just immediately started liking each other before we ever met each other. Really, just there was just this resonance between us. It was like a chemistry thing. So we just continued interacting online up until I dropped out of the monkhood, and then I went and met her in person, and we are together to this day. So he says, I'd imagine finding love was hard for you as a monk. Um, Not as hard as you might think, actually. Especially in the West. Western women do not see monks as celibate holy men. They just see monks as another kind of man. So there's that too. So we'll just move on to Austin's next question. And Austin says, what would be the difference between nirvana and a materialist's view of death? My understanding is nirvana is a state of non-arising of any being or senses, not too dissimilar in my opinion. Well, death for a materialist would just be blank nothing. You know, it would just be extinction, nothingness. And nirvana really is not nothing. I mean, sometimes it's, especially in older texts or like older translations, nirvana can be translated as extinction. But really, it's like the blowing out of a candle, or blowing out of a flame. And the ancient Indians, um, they believed fire was a god. It was like it was divine. It was the god Agni was fire, and so they had different ideas about fire than we do. I mean, nowadays we blow out a candle flame and that's it, and the candle flame has ceased to exist. But in ancient India, they had this idea that like this the spirit of fire was just pervasive, and it would assume like like a material existence, like an obvious material existence while it was burning, but then when it went out again, it would just go back to this like this formless, invisible state. And so that's kind of what nirvana was originally meant to represent in the old metaphors of the flame going out. Um, So, but I mean, just even setting that aside, even setting aside ancient ideas about fire in India, nirvana is essentially merging with ultimate reality. At least that's my interpretation. That's one possible interpretation. Like a fully enlightened being has already attained nirvana. Like the Buddha himself had already attained nirvana before he died. It's not just something that happens to you after you die. Like an enlightened being, after they die, they attain parinirvana, but they attain nirvana even while they're still alive. So it's just awareness of ultimate reality, really, at least in my opinion. So, I mean, to a materialist, it might seem like they're the same just simply because a materialist is not a mystic. He doesn't accept that there's this this formless infinity, or that just completely transcends even the duality of existence and non-existence. I mean, a materialist doesn't think that way really, as a general rule. So, um, yeah, nirvana is a mystical state, and just sheer utter non-existence is not a mystical state. That would be the main difference, I would say. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. Do you believe there are any fully enlightened beings today or in recent memory? Well, this is kind of a trick question. And I mean, I've already been talking about enlightened beings, but from a samsaric point of view, from a worldly point of view, I mean, they may not exist at all. It might just be like it's like a paradox, or like a trick question, or um, it's just kind of it's just this weird paradox, enlightenment. But if there are any fully enlightened beings, let's assume that you can point to someone and say, yes, that person is or is not fully enlightened. Yeah, I would say that there have been fully enlightened beings in recent memory. I think Ramana Maharshi, who was a Hindu, is a very good candidate for full enlightenment. I think Neem Karoli Baba, who is also a Hindu, although with a very different personality and character than Ramana Maharshi, I think he's those would be my two top candidates for fully enlightened beings. Of course, there are plenty of people claim to be fully enlightened. Both of the famous Krishnamurtis, Eckhart Tolle claims to be fully enlightened. One of my favorites in recent years is Paul Lowe, who somehow is, I mean, sometimes he insinuates that he's fully enlightened, and other times he says kind of like what I was saying just moments ago, that, I mean, enlightenment doesn't necessarily even mean anything. Um, Byron Katie is claimed to be fully enlightened. Adyashanti, I think, is claimed to be fully enlightened. Um, but whether they really are or not, I mean, it could just be a trick question. Osho was claimed to be fully enlightened. Um, yeah, so in a way, it's kind of a trick question. Webu Sayadaw would be a good possibility for a Theravada Buddhist monk who may have been fully enlightened. Also, some people believe Ajahn Chah was enlightened. Some people believe Ajahn Mun was enlightened. Um, but I guess you're asking, Austin here is asking, do I believe there are any fully enlightened beings today or in recent memory? And I do think it could just be like a paradoxical trick question, because within the context of samsara and just worldly thinking and words and language and all that, that kind of context, just a fully enlightened being is just kind of a paradox. It's almost meaningless. But just assuming that there are enlightened beings, yeah, I would say that there are enlightened beings. Like Ram Dass, who I'm pretty sure believed his guru Neem Karoli Baba was fully enlightened. He used to say that people could just go halfway around the world and search Himalayan caves looking for an enlightened holy man, when the whole time their Aunt Margaret back in Vermont was fully enlightened the whole time. And the thing is that instead of telling you like the secrets of the universe, you just say have some soup. But it turns out that was the perfect thing to say under the circumstances, is have some soup. But the very short answer to this is I would just say, yeah, I do believe there are fully enlightened beings today or in recent memory. And so I'll just move on to Austin's next and last question. Wouldn't fascism be contrary to Buddhism? Fascism would be clinging to nation and culture, which are inherently impermanent. Well, this is, I think this is a follow-up to a question I answered last time, I think, on the last Q&A. Someone was asking me if fascism was compatible with Buddhism. And the answer is still pretty much the same. I mean, in the Buddhist time, most countries were like autocratic kingdoms that were fairly close to fascism already. There have been fascists who endorsed Buddhism, the most famous being Julius Evola, who I don't think he considered himself to be a Buddhist, although his life was changed by being introduced to Buddhism, and he certainly endorsed it as a noble Aryan, virile kind of spiritual system that was suitable for like the Aryan aristocracy of Europe. But the thing is that, I mean, Buddhism can exist under any system that allows it to exist. So, like Marxism might be contrary to Buddhism because Marxism is contrary to any kind of spiritual system. Um, but say fascism would be clinging to nation and culture, which are inherently impermanent. But a devout Buddhist, a serious practitioner, renounces the world, so that he is renouncing nation and culture. So it's just sort of like a fringe thing that goes on. It's like the heart of Buddhism isn't really political. It's not, it's not run by the government or any such thing. Even though someplace like Thailand, where the Sangha and the government are closely related, um, still, I mean, Thailand's kind of under a military dictatorship, or has been on numerous occasions. So yeah, I don't see that fascism is contrary to Buddhism. I mean, like Spain under Franco was Catholic. In fact, I mean, you could argue that in like medieval times, or even like the Roman Empire could have been called more or less fascistic. and it was Christian. And so really it's the spirituality doesn't necessarily have to follow along with the political ideology. They're just in a way they're separate. Or in even if you've got like this autocratic king who just declares, everyone's going to be Buddhist. I just I hereby decree that the country is going to convert to Buddhism, which has happened in the past. Um, Still, I mean, it's not, I don't see how there's any necessary conflict because Buddhism arose in a time with autocratic kings and, some of them were just sociopaths. So, yeah, I really don't see any kind of problem there. So the next question is from Mary, spelled Merry. And Mary says, how can one experience not craving for existence and not craving for non-existence at the same time? So I think this is uh, kind of a follow-up on a doctrine of Theravada Buddhism about the three kinds of craving. There are three kinds of craving: craving for sensual pleasure, craving for existence, and craving for non-existence. And so Mary's asking, how can you not crave for existence and not crave for non-existence at the same time? Well, you just don't crave for anything. So if you don't have any cravings for anything, you're not craving for further existence and you're not craving for an end to existence. I mean, you're just taking each moment as it comes without craving anything, without setting yourself up against the way things are. You just accept the way things are, and so you're not like setting up any kind of friction with the universe. So that was fairly simple. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Lucid, and this is a surprisingly hard question to answer. Lucid says, who is the wokest Buddhist you know? And I mean, really, I can't say that I know any woke Buddhists. I mean, obviously, woke Buddhists don't want to have anything to do with me. Woke Buddhists will just, there's a certain woke Buddhist monk who runs a website, kind of a Buddhist forum, and I've been told that he just deletes like references to me just as a matter of course because supposedly I'm a Nazi. But I mean, of Buddhists that I know of, that venerable bhikkhu who might as well remain unnamed, or partly because he's higher profile, maybe Bhikkhu Bodhi. He's pretty woke, seems to me. But of the ones that I know personally, that would be a tough question. I'd have to say that um, when I lived in Bellingham, Washington, and was temporarily interacting with the local Insight Meditation Society there, I mean, it could be any one of a fairly large number of those. Um, yeah, it probably of the people that I've met personally, that I have known, not just met, it would probably be one of the Buddhists in Bellingham, Washington, who are a member of the local Insight meditation group. And yeah, like college educated people in the Pacific Northwest tend to be fairly left leaning. And there's no telling how woke they got. I mean, I left before the real insanity started. Like that was around 2015, I guess. I left before then, so it's hard to say. I mean, some of them might have just turned into woke Caligulas or something. And technically, I would have known them in the past anyway. But really, I can't say. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Unofficial. And Mr. Unofficial says, what is the Buddhist definition of a human? And that's kind of a good question. It could be taken from different directions. I mean, um, Buddhism does not give like a biological definition of a human, as far as I know. I mean, like in the Pali text, there's no um, there's no sutta where the Buddha or anyone else is differentiating humans from from any other species of animal. And in a way, we're kind of an animal that is capable of becoming enlightened. I mean, that would define a human, and that's sort of implied in the text. Like Nagas, who are like shape-shifting cobra dragons, are not allowed to be ordained as monks. There's actually a rule about this, that because they are an animal, they're not allowed, they're not able to become enlightened, and so they're not allowed to be ordained as monks. So that would be one way of doing it. But I mean, ultimately, it's all delusional because, from the Buddhist point of view, no actual human really exists. We're just a collection of the five khandhas, or the five aggregates. So a human is, from that point of view, a human is just a certain collection of physicality, feelings, perceptions, will, and consciousness. That those are the five aggregates that compose a human being. They compose other beings also that aren't human, but just going with this kind of definition, it would be a certain kind of, collection of the five aggregates that, walks on two legs and has culture, and um, is capable, at least potentially, of becoming enlightened. So, yeah, there's not much anthropology actually in Buddhism. So I'll just move on to the next question, also from Mr. Unofficial. And Mr. Unofficial says, what is your opinion on cannabis and psychedelics for spiritual growth? How should they be used for maximum benefit? Have you had any profound psychedelic experiences in your life? Well, I touched on this to a previous question about whether you go to hell from smoking cannabis. And yeah, I mean, of of people of my generation who became monks, I think probably most of them began with cannabis and psychedelics. Maybe it's different now, I can't say, but it's, you take cannabis and then psychedelics, and you have these profound mystical experiences. You see things in a way that seems just as valid in its own way as the usual normal waking state, and it kind of triangulates, and it gives you the insight that there's more than one way of looking at reality, and then it causes an interest in practicing meditative techniques where you can expand the consciousness and get into these profound states without having to use the chemicals. So I do think that if used wisely and not just abused, or just used recreationally for mundane reasons, then it's very valuable, or it can be. And how should they be used for maximum benefit is, well, you should use them with like a desire for spiritual benefit to be a result of taking them. I mean, if you just drop acid at a party or something, that would not produce maximum benefit. But if you go hiking alone out into the forest, I used to do this. This was like one of my earlier spiritual practices before I became a monk. Just hike alone out into a wilderness area and take acid by yourself out in the woods, in a quiet place where you won't be bothered. You won't have to interact with other people. There's no rules out there for you to break. There's no artificial rules. Yeah, you can have profound experiences. And then here's the question. The last part of this question is, have you had any profound psychedelic experiences in your life? Almost every time, not absolutely every time, but almost every time I've ever taken LSD or mushrooms, it's like everything just becomes a manifestation of divinity. It's just like divinity is the essence, and you just have all these different forms of it. It's just everything is like an emanation of God, so to speak. And that's usually my experience when I take something like LSD, is that, everything just becomes a manifestation of divinity, and that in itself is, that is a profound experience. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Brambo. And Brambo says, did the Buddha teach that bhikkhus should give blessings to people? How does that work? Um, I'm not exactly sure about mentions of blessings in the text, although certainly the Buddha taught that bhikkhus should send metta to people, and that's usually the way people ask for blessings in Burma, which is possibly the most Buddhist country in the world, says, please send metta. Sometimes they'll say, supeon, which is like, supe is like, give a gift, but it's like the gift of a blessing or the gift of metta, or, loving kindness, benevolent feeling, well wishes. So definitely, it's mentioned many times in the text that bhikkhus should just feel love for everybody, and just sometimes, I mean, like if you're doing meditation, you're like beaming love to individuals or to groups of people, or just in all directions. So that is probably more orthodox than, the may you be well, may you be happy kind of a thing. I mean, just saying may you be well, may you be happy is like a formula for sending metta too. So that's also the blessing and the sending of metta are just the same, essentially. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Chaplin. And Chaplin says, are you making any resolutions or do you have any plans for the new year? No, I really don't make resolutions. I kind of go with Jiddu Krishnamurti on making resolutions. It's like, you just do what you can, but if you make some kind of resolution or rule for yourself, then you're setting yourself up for like breaking rules, and just being dishonest and hypocrisy and dashed ideals and all that. Just be yourself mindfully would be his approach. Um, I used to have a joke resolution I'd make every year, and that was I wasn't going to smoke. I made two joke resolutions every year. This is back when I was a young man. One is I'm not going to smoke weed anymore, and the second one was I'm not going to smoke weed any less. I'm going to smoke it just the same, which is kind of an easy resolution to keep. Second part of this question is, do you have any plans for the new year other than just hanging out with my sweetie at home, not going out to any parties or anything? Going out and making noise at midnight. That's my plan for New Year's Eve. Um, Plans for the new year, I may finally uh, stop working in the warehouse at the sheet metal shop and move up front and start selling sheet metal, which was a job that was offered to me back around July, but things moved slow in South Carolina. But yeah, plans for the new year is just continue forwards, just continue on the same track. So I'll just move on to the next question from Chaplin. And this is, how is the new year measured in Buddhism, and do they celebrate a new year? Well, just going with strict Theravada Buddhism, not any national cultural deviations from that. Um, the year of the Buddhist era begins with the Buddha's Enlightenment, and so it's the full moon of May, or the full moon of Kason in Burmese, which usually is in May, would be the beginning of the next Buddhist year. Although Buddhist countries have different ways of measuring New Year, like in India, which isn't technically Buddhist, but also in Burma and in Thailand, they follow like medieval Indian like astrology or astronomy. So in Burma and Thailand, their New Year's is nowadays New Year's Day would be April 17th, I'm pretty sure. And technically, that is the day that the sun passes through the meridian containing the star Zeta Piscium. Because back in medieval India, some astronomer calculated that at the beginning of the universe, just who knows how many zillions of years ago, that all the sun, the moon, and all the planets were in conjunction at the star Zeta Piscium. And I think that is the lunar mansion of Rewadi. So in Burma and Thailand, their official New Year's Day um, is around April 17th. It's like a 5 day transition when the sun is passing through this lunar mansion, and in Burmese it's called Thinjan, and in Thailand it's called Songkran. And it's just two pronunciations of the same Sanskrit word that means just crossing over. It's like the sun is crossing through this meridian where all the sun, moon, and planets were all in conjunction at the beginning of the universe. But technically, the Buddhist New Year is um, the day that the Buddha became enlightened and started the wheel of Dharma uh, rolling. So I'll just move on to Chaplin's next and third question. Do you think the Dalai Lama is an arm of the globalists used to control people, similar to how they used the Rainbow Pope to indoctrinate Catholics into woke Marxism? I really am not a close follower of the Dalai Lama. Um, I think he has, to some degree, endorsed the whole global warming hysteria. Partly, I think, just due to like naivete. He did some kind of interview with Greta Thunberg. I remember Brian Ruhe and I did a video on it. It was a relatively popular one. But I think that's not necessarily being the same as an arm of the globalists, unless it's just an unwitting one in that certain respect. But in other ways, the Dalai Lama is very politically incorrect. For example, he has said a number of times that the so-called refugees in Europe who are coming from northern Africa and the Middle East should just go back to where they came from, that Europe is for Europeans. And that's certainly not what the globalists want people to hear. And I think another thing that kind of counts against him being an arm of the globalists is that obviously he's sort of an anti-Chinese figure. And back when the Marxists and the communists were the bad guys in mainstream Western culture, he was a hero, but now he's kind of an embarrassment because they're all kissing the ass of the Chinese Communist Party, the globalists are. And so he's just seen as sort of a problem for China, which makes him a problem for the globalists who are kissing the Chinese behind. So yeah, I doubt that the Dalai Lama is a stooge for the globalists. I mean, he might be used for propaganda purposes if he happens to say the right thing, like about global warming or something. But my relatively uneducated guess is that yeah, he's not really. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is the last question, and it is from Pseudonym. And I'm guessing that that's not his real name. And Pseudonym says, I am hoping to hear your thoughts on an idea. The following is constructed around the analogy of the path to enlightenment being analogous to summiting a great mountain, metaphorical complements to Evola. As I understand it, if one renounces the world and diligently follows the Eightfold Path and lives by the Vinaya, Buddhism can lead toward the upper reaches of the mountain, perhaps to the snow line. However, the final push to the summit or enlightenment rests on the individual making their own way. The Buddhist path prepared the individual for the challenge, but ultimately they are alone. Could it be that Jiddu Krishnamurti and others have provided further direction to aid in the final push? Conversely, to simply crack open a Krishnamurti text with no dharmic foundation, might that not be like parachuting into the higher reaches of the mountain in board shorts and flip-flops? Please feel free to riff on this in any way that makes sense to you. Thank you. Well, when I hear about spirituality and moving towards enlightenment compared to climbing a mountain, of course, I think of St. John of the Cross and the ascent of Mount Carmel. And the whole path up the mountain is nada, 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 nada. With just nothing, 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 nothing. You just follow the nothing until you reach the perfection of nothing. And then you're at the top of the mountain. And he apparently got to the top of it, at least from, I mean, he speaks with authority. He seems to be, anyway, speaking with authority in his writings. Um, Buddhism, on the other hand, I mean, there may be mentions of it. I don't remember, like, becoming enlightened as being compared with reaching the summit of Mount Meru. Maybe not a good comparison because the summit of Mount Meru is where the Tawatimsa heaven is supposed to be located. And so that's nowhere near becoming enlightened if you're just getting into a heaven realm that's just a few levels above us. Uh, yeah, it's in a way it's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, comparing it to climbing a mountain because different people can become enlightened at different stages. It's not like you're following a path till you reach the end of the path because the path doesn't have an end. It's just that the path just keeps going. So you just follow the path or you're climbing the mountain, getting higher, 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 and you're never going to reach the top because it doesn't have a top. So eventually you just bail out sideways. And some people have to get to the most refined mental states. They have to master fourth jhana. They have to be able to sit there empty, just cessation of perception and feeling, the concentration of just what is it? The signless concentration. They have to get to the most refined meditative states and master them. And sometimes even then they won't become enlightened. There's no guarantee. But some people, they don't even have to get to the first jhana, supposedly, if you can believe some of the texts. There are what are called dry visioned arahants that haven't mastered jhana and haven't gotten any psychic powers. They're just enlightened without even psychic powers or anything. So it's like if you compare it with a ladder, you're climbing the ladder and you're getting into more and more subtle mental states, but sooner or later you just realize that there's no top. You're never going to reach the top, and then you just let go. You just jump off, and that's it. And some people have to get much higher than others. So some people could become enlightened when they're still in the foothills, presumably. And that seems to be the way it is for Western people who like have some kind of experience that like an awakening experience. It just hits them over the head. They're just a normie, a lot of them, like Eckhart Tolle, assuming, we don't have to assume that he's fully enlightened, but just he had this awakening experience without having been a meditator or anything first. Even Ramana Maharshi was like that. He wasn't a meditator. He was just an ordinary high school student. And he just had this crisis that just slammed him into enlightenment. So it doesn't work as a like the whole metaphor of climbing the mountain. It doesn't really fit very well because um, there's no top to the mountain. Is enlightenment just is completely off the scale. It's completely out of the system. Nirvana is not one of the 31 planes of existence. It's not a plane of existence at all. It transcends existence. And that transcendence can happen, just about at any time, any point. Although it becomes more and more likely the more advanced your mental states become, the more subtle they become. So let's see, I kind of answered part of the question anyway. Let's see, rests on the individual making. Yeah, I think Buddhism, if you practice it correctly, it can take you all the way to enlightenment. At least it gets you to the point where you've gotten all you need to get and you can just let go, and then that's it. In Buddhism, there's more talk about crossing a flood than climbing a mountain as a metaphor for enlightenment. And you cross the flood with the raft of Dharma, and then you throw the raft away because you don't need it anymore. But I do think that a lot of Buddhists have become enlightened through practicing Buddhism without having to depend on or without having to use any other system. Um, let's see. Conversely, to simply crack open a Krishnamurti text with no dharmic foundation, might that not be like parachuting into the higher reaches of the mountain in board shorts and flip-flops? Yeah, I don't think if someone who's unprepared reads a Krishnamurti book, it'd be like reading a physics text. You've got some normie, who doesn't have a college education or anything. He's it's just gonna be over his head. He's just not gonna get it. Um, if you get it, you're ready to get it, I assume. But yeah, I do think that just practicing like Orthodox Theravada or maybe slightly unorthodox Theravada, like old-fashioned Theravada, the way it was taught in the early days without all the later accretions, I think that would be sufficient if one's temperament is attuned to that. Other people might have a different kind of temperament and they might need a different kind of path. But Theravada Buddhism, not what it has become necessarily, but what it still can be, like the essence of it distilled from the text that are this essence still is followed by some of the best monks. That yeah, I think this is sufficient. And that was the last question. So I'm done. I won't answer any more because there aren't any more. So I hope I did a decent job of answering these questions. I hope I didn't completely mess up any of them. And if you have any more questions about Buddhism or spirituality, philosophy, meditation, Burma, me personally, anything you think I might be able to answer, just feel free to include your question in the comments below. If you have access to my Subscribe Star channel, you can leave questions there. If you have access to the Discord server associated with the Subscribe Star channel, you can leave questions there. I caution you not to just leave questions in random places because they might not wind up on the list. I might just overlook. Like if there's a question put under like a random video of mine that isn't a Q&A video or isn't the latest one, I can't guarantee that I'll remember to include that on the list. And if you haven't subscribed already, please do so and hit the like button and take a look at the URL links, including the links to my books that are for sale on Amazon. And be happy.